The rain was falling hard on the old city of Karachi when 17-year-old Hamza stepped out of the small house he shared with his mother and younger sister, Fatima, who was only 9 years old and always asked too many questions about everything in the world around her. He pulled his worn-out jacket tighter around his thin body and looked up at the gray sky that seemed angry and tired at the same time, much like how he felt every single morning when he woke up before the sun to get ready for another long day of work at the textile factory near the port. His mother stood at the door behind him, her eyes filled with that familiar sadness she tried so hard to hide behind her gentle smile, and she called out to him in a soft voice that carried through the sound of the rain. "Come back safe, my son," she said, and Hamza nodded without turning around, because he knew that if he looked at her face right now, he would see the dark circles under her eyes and the lines of worry that had made her look 20 years older than she actually was. He walked fast through the narrow streets, where dirty water ran along the edges, and stray cats hid under broken carts and old newspapers, and he thought about his father, who had disappeared 3 years ago on a night just like this one, a night when the rain would not stop, and the world felt like it was trying to wash away everything good. Nobody knew what had happened to Ahmed Khan, and the police had stopped looking after only 2 weeks, saying that men like him disappeared all the time in a city this big, that it was nothing special, nothing worth their precious time and energy. But Hamza knew his father was not the kind of man who would just walk away from his family, without a word, without a goodbye, without leaving something behind for the children he loved more than his own life. Ahmed Khan had been a train conductor for the Pakistan Railways for 22 years, job with his whole heart, always coming home with stories about the places he had seen and the people he had met during his long journeys across the country. He used to sit Hamza on his knee and tell him about the mountains in the north, where the snow never melted and the rivers ran so clear you could see the stones at the bottom, and about the deserts in the south, where the sand stretched out forever like a golden ocean that had no end. "One day I will take you on the train with me," his father had promised many times, and Hamza had believed him every single time, because his father was a man who always kept his promises, always did what he said he would do, no matter how difficult it might be. But that promise was never kept, and now Hamza worked 12 hours a day in a hot and dusty factory, where the machines were so loud they made his ears ring long after he had left the building and walked back through those same narrow streets to his small house. Just enough money to keep his family alive, to put rice and lentils on the table, and to pay for Fatima's school fees, because their mother had made him swear that his sister would get an education, no matter what happened. "Your father would have wanted that," she always said, and Hamza agreed, because he remembered how his father used to read books late at night by the light of a small lamp, turning the pages slowly and carefully as if each one contained a secret that needed to be treated with respect. Today was different from other days, though, and Hamza could feel it in his bones, the way some people say they can feel a storm coming before the first cloud appears in the sky. When he arrived at the factory, his friend and co-worker Bilal was standing outside the gate with a strange look on his face, like someone who had just seen something he could not explain and was not sure if he should even try. "Brother, you need to hear this," Bilal said, grabbing Hamza by the collar, arm, and pulling him to the side of the building, where nobody could hear them over the noise of the generators and the trucks that were loading fabric onto their flatbeds. "What is it now?" Hamza asked, feeling tired already, even though his shift had not even started yet. Bilal reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper that looked old and yellow, like it had been sitting somewhere forgotten for a very long time, and he handed it to Hamza with shaking fingers. "My uncle works at the railway office in the records department, and he was cleaning out old files yesterday when he found this," Bilal explained, his voice dropping to a whisper, even though there was nobody around to hear them. Hamza unfolded the paper carefully, and his heart began to beat faster when he saw his father's name written at the top in official railway letterhead. It was some kind of internal report dated just 3 days before his father had disappeared, about an investigation into missing cargo from train number 247, which was the overnight express that ran from Karachi to Peshawar, the very same train his father had worked on for the last 5 years of his career. The report said that Ahmed Khan had filed a formal complaint about suspicious activities he had witnessed during his shifts, that he had seen men loading unmarked boxes onto the train in the middle of the night at small stations where there were no security cameras and no other witnesses. He had reported this to his supervisors, not once but 4 times, and each time his complaint had been ignored or dismissed as the imagination of an aging conductor who had spent too many years on the rails. Hamza's hands were trembling as he read the final paragraph, which stated that a meeting had been scheduled between Ahmed Khan and a senior railway official named Colonel Rashid Mahmood on the very night his father had vanished from the face of the earth. "Your uncle find this exactly?" Hamza asked, his voice barely above a whisper now. "In a box that was supposed to be destroyed," Bilal replied, looking around nervously, as if the walls themselves might be listening to their conversation. Hamza folded the paper and put it carefully inside his jacket pocket, pressing it against his chest where he could feel it against his heartbeat. For 3 years, he had been told that his father had simply left, that he had abandoned his family, that he was probably living somewhere far away with a new wife and new children, and he had refused to believe any of it. Now he held proof in his hands that something much darker had happened, that his father had stumbled onto something dangerous and had paid the price for trying to do the right thing in a world that did not always reward honesty. He looked at Bilal and said only 5 words that would change the direction of his entire life forever. Peshawar. Bilal's eyes went wide, and he shook his head quickly, telling Hamza that he was being foolish, that whatever had happened to his father was in the past, and digging it up now would only bring more trouble to a family that had already suffered enough. But Hamza was not listening anymore, because inside his chest a fire had been lit that no amount of rain could ever put out, and he knew with absolute certainty that he would not rest until he found the truth about what had happened to Ahmed Khan on that dark and rainy night 3 years ago. He would take the train to Peshawar, the same route his father had traveled hundreds of times, and he would find Colonel Rashid Mahmood, and he would look that man in the eyes and demand to know what had happened at that meeting. The rain kept falling on the old city, but Hamza did not feel cold anymore. Telling his mother was the hardest thing Hamza had ever done. Harder even than the day he had dropped out of school to work at the factory. Harder than the nights he had spent lying awake in the dark, listening to her cry softly in the next room, when she thought her children were asleep. She sat on the floor of their small kitchen with her back against the wall and her hands folded in her lap, and she listened without saying a word as Hamza showed her the paper and explained what it meant and what he planned to do about it. When he finished talking, the silence between them was so heavy it felt like a physical thing, like a blanket made of stone that had been draped over both of their shoulders. "Your father was a brave man," she finally said, and her voice did not shake the way Hamza had expected it to. "And that bravery is what took him away from us." She looked up at her son with eyes that were dry and clear, and Hamza realized, with a sudden shock, already known, or at least suspected, that his father's disappearance was not a simple case of a man walking away from his responsibilities. "Cannot lose another person I love to whatever darkness swallowed your father." Hamza squeezed her hands and promised her that he would be careful, that he would not take unnecessary risks, that he would go to Peshawar and ask questions quietly, and come back home within a week. She did not believe him, and they both knew it. But she also knew that her son had the same fire burning inside him that had burned inside his father. The same inability to look away from injustice. The same stubborn refusal to accept that the world was simply unfair and nothing could be done about it. Little Fatima appeared in the doorway, with sleep still in her eyes and her hair tangled from a restless night. And she looked at her mother and brother sitting together on the kitchen floor, and immediately knew something important was happening. "Are you going somewhere?" she asked Hamza, with that sharp intelligence that always surprised people who expected a 9-year-old to be unaware of the serious things happening around her. "I am going on a trip for a few days," Hamza told her, trying to keep his voice light and normal. "I need to take care of something important." "Is it about Baba?" Fatima asked, and the question hit Hamza like a punch to the stomach, because he had not realized how much his little sister understood about the family's pain and the unanswered questions that hung over their household like a permanent cloud. He pulled her into a hug and held her tight and told her that yes, it was about their father, and that when he came back, he would have answers for all of them. The next morning, Hamza went to the Karachi City railway station with a small bag that contained 2 sets of clothes, some bread and fruit his mother had packed, the old railway report folded carefully inside a plastic bag to protect it from the rain, and every rupee he had saved over the past 6 months, which amounted to just enough to buy a one-way ticket on the economy class of the Khyber Mail Express that ran from Karachi all the way up to Peshawar. The station was enormous and chaotic, filled with hundreds of people moving in every direction at once, carrying bags and boxes and children on their hips, shouting to each other across the platforms, buying tea and samosas from the vendors who weaved through the crowds with their metal trays balanced perfectly on one hand. Hamza had not been inside a railway station since he was a small boy, when his father used to bring him here on weekends and let him sit in the conductor's cabin and pretend to drive the great locomotives that roared and hissed like sleeping dragons waking up from a long dream. The memories hit him so hard that he had to stop and lean against a pillar for a moment, closing his eyes and breathing deeply while the noise of the station swirled around him like a river flowing past a stone. He could almost hear his father's voice saying, "This is where the magic happens, son," and pointing at the trains lined up on the tracks, with their doors open and their engines humming. When he opened his eyes again, he noticed something strange. A man was watching him from across the platform. A tall man in a dark gray shalwar kameez, with a neatly trimmed beard and sharp eyes that seemed to be studying Hamza the way a hawk studies a mouse from high up in the sky. When Hamza looked directly at him, the man did not look away or pretend to be doing something else the way most people would when caught staring at a stranger. Instead, he held Hamza's gaze for a long moment, then turned and disappeared into the crowd as smoothly as a fish slipping back into dark water. Hamza told himself it was nothing, that busy railway stations were full of all kinds of people, and not everyone who looked at you was a threat. But a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that he should be more careful than he had planned to be. Platform number 7, and climbed aboard, squeezing past families and businessmen and soldiers until he found his seat in the economy section, which was a hard wooden bench near the window, with barely enough room for his legs. The train was scheduled to depart at 6 in the evening and would arrive in Peshawar the following afternoon, a journey of roughly 20 hours that would take them through the farmlands of Sindh, across the rivers of Punjab, and up into the rugged hills of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. Hamza pressed his face against the window and watched the platform as the last passengers hurried aboard, and the chai sellers made their final rounds, and he thought about all the times his father had made this same journey, and all the things his father's eyes had seen from windows just like this one. A whistle blew sharp and loud, and the train lurched forward with a groaning sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside the earth itself, and slowly, the platform began to slide backwards as the great machine picked up speed. Karachi fell away behind them, its buildings and towers and minarets shrinking into the distance until they were just tiny shapes against the orange sky of sunset. And then they were gone entirely, and there was nothing but open country stretching out on both sides of the tracks. The man sitting across from Hamza was an old gentleman with white hair and a kind face, and he introduced himself as Professor Zahid, a retired history teacher from Lahore who was traveling to visit his grandchildren in Rawalpindi. They began talking the way strangers do on long train rides, sharing small pieces of their lives with each other like trading cards, and the professor told wonderful stories about the history of the Pakistani railway system and how it had been built by the British over 100 years ago and had connected the entire subcontinent in ways that nothing else could. The railway is the spine of this country, the professor said with genuine love in his voice. Without it, we would be just a collection of separate cities that do not know each other. Hamza wanted to tell the professor about his father and the real reason for his journey, but something held him back, an instinct for caution that he was developing quickly now that he was out in the world on his own for the first time. Instead, he listened and nodded and ate the bread his mother had packed, and he watched the landscape change outside the window as the train moved north through the darkness. Hours passed, and most of the passengers fell asleep, their heads bobbing gently with the rhythm of the train, and the cabin grew quiet except for the steady clacking of the wheels on the tracks that sounded like a heartbeat, like the pulse of some great living thing carrying them all through the night. Hamza could not sleep, and around midnight he got up to stretch his legs and walk through the train. Through one car after another, each one filled with sleeping bodies and the smell of tea and spices and engine oil. He reached the space between two carriages where the wind came in cold and strong through the gaps in the doors, and he stood there for a moment, breathing the night air and looking up at the stars that were impossibly bright out here, away from the city lights. And that was when he heard voices coming from the next car, low and urgent voices that were clearly trying not to be heard, speaking in quick, sharp sentences that Hamza could not quite make out over the noise of the wind and the wheels. He leaned closer to the door and pressed his ear against the cold metal, and he caught just a few words that made his blood go cold. Someone said the name Ahmed Khan, and then someone else laughed, a short, ugly laugh that had no humor in it at all, and then a third voice said something about making sure the boy did not cause the same problems his father had caused. Hamza stepped back from the door, with his heart pounding so hard he was sure it could be heard over the noise of the train. Someone on this train knew who he was and why he was here, and that meant his journey had just become far more dangerous than he had ever imagined it would be. Hamza moved quickly and quietly back through the swaying carriages, his mind racing faster than the train itself, and every shadow in the dark cabins seemed to reach out toward him, like hands trying to grab his jacket and hold him still. He returned to his seat and sat down, pulling his bag close to his chest, and he forced himself to breathe slowly and think clearly about what he had just heard. Someone on this train knew his name, knew his father's name, and knew that he was traveling with a purpose that made him a threat to whoever had been responsible for Ahmed Khan's disappearance. The question that burned the brightest in his brain was a simple one. How did they know? He had only told 3 people about his plan: his mother, his sister Fatima, and his friend Bilal. His mother would never betray him, and Fatima was too young to have spoken to anyone outside the family, which left Bilal, and the thought of his friend selling him out made Hamza feel sick in a way that had nothing to do with the rocking motion of the train. But then he remembered something else. Bilal had said his uncle worked in the railway records department, and if the uncle had found that report, perhaps the uncle had also told someone else about it before giving it to Bilal. Perhaps the uncle had not even known he was putting anyone in danger. Perhaps he had simply mentioned it to a colleague over tea, the way people share interesting gossip, and that colleague had told someone else, and that someone else had told the wrong person entirely. Information was like water, Hamza thought. It always found cracks to flow through, no matter how carefully you tried to contain it. The old professor was snoring gently across from him, and Hamza envied the man's peaceful sleep, envied his simple journey to see grandchildren and drink tea and tell stories about history that was safely in the past, where it could not hurt anyone anymore. Slowly, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that spilled through the train windows and woke the passengers one by one, like a gentle hand touching each person on the shoulder. The train had entered Punjab now, and the landscape had changed dramatically from the flat, dry land of Sindh to rich green fields of wheat and sugarcane that stretched to the horizon in every direction, divided by narrow irrigation channels that sparkled like silver ribbons in the morning light. Hamza went to the small bathroom at the end of the carriage and splashed water on his face, and when he looked at himself in the cracked mirror, he saw a young man who looked older than 17, with serious dark eyes and a jaw that was set in a way that said he would not be turning back. When he returned to his seat, he found someone new sitting in the spot next to the professor. It was a woman, perhaps 30 years old, with intelligent eyes behind simple glasses, and a notebook open on her lap that was filled with handwriting so small and neat it looked like it had been printed by a machine. She looked up at Hamza and smiled in a friendly way that immediately made him suspicious, because he had spent the last 12 hours learning that not everyone on this train was what they appeared to be. "I hope you do not mind," she said, gesturing at the seat she had taken. "My original seat is next to a man who has been trying to talk to me since Sukur, and I needed a change of scenery." The professor laughed and told her she was welcome to stay as long as she wanted, and he introduced Hamza as his young traveling companion, even though they had only met the night before. The woman said her name was Nadia, and that she was a journalist working for a small independent newspaper in Islamabad, and she was on her way to Peshawar to cover a story about corruption in government-run transportation services. Hamza felt every muscle in his body go tight when she said the word transportation, and he studied her face carefully for any sign that this was not a coincidence, that she had come to sit near him on purpose, that she was part of whatever web of danger he had stumbled into. But Nadia seemed genuine, and as they talked through the morning, while the train stopped at station after station to pick up and drop off passengers, Hamza began to feel that perhaps the universe was not entirely against him after all. She told him about the stories she had investigated before, about how she had once spent 6 months pretending to work at a government office just to gather evidence of officials stealing money that was meant for building schools in poor villages. "Most people think journalism is about writing articles," she said while sipping tea from a paper cup she had bought from a vendor at the Multan station. "But really it is about listening, about paying attention to the things that do not add up, and having the courage to keep asking questions when powerful people tell you to stop." Hamza made a decision in that moment that went against every instinct of caution he had developed since overhearing those voices in the night. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the folded railway report and handed it to Nadia without saying a word. She read it slowly, her eyes moving back and forth across the page, and when she finished, she looked up at Hamza with an expression that was equal parts excitement and concern. "This is your father?" she asked quietly. Hamza nodded and told her everything, about his father's disappearance, about the years of not knowing, about the report that Bilal's uncle had found, and about the voices he had heard in the night, speaking his father's name in a way that made it clear they considered the Khan family to be a problem that needed to be dealt with. Nadia listened with the focused attention of someone who had been trained to absorb information the way a sponge absorbs water, and when he was finished, she closed her notebook and looked at him with those sharp, intelligent eyes. "You are in danger right now," she said, stating it as a fact rather than an opinion. Whoever these people are, they have been watching you since Karachi, which means they have connections inside the railway system, possibly at the highest levels. I know, Hamza replied, and he was surprised by how calm his own voice sounded. I have been investigating the Pakistan Railways corruption network for almost a year now, Nadia told him, leaning close so that only he could hear. I have sources who tell me that certain high-ranking officials have been using freight trains to smuggle goods across the country for over a decade, weapons, stolen antiquities, sometimes even people, and that anyone who has tried to expose this operation has been silenced. She paused and let that word hang in the air between them like smoke. Have been one of those people, she continued, and if Colonel Rashid Mahmood is involved, then you are walking into something far bigger and more dangerous than one missing conductor. Hamza asked her what she knew about Colonel Mahmood, and Nadia pulled out her notebook and flipped to a page filled with names and arrows connecting them in a pattern that looked like a spider's web. She explained that Mahmood was not actually a colonel in the military, but had earned the nickname because of the way he ran his section of the railway administration like a military operation, with strict discipline and absolute loyalty demanded from everyone who worked under him. He controlled the northern routes, the ones that ran through the tribal areas near the Afghan border, and these routes were the ones most commonly used for the smuggling operations because the terrain was difficult and law enforcement presence was thin. Several people who had worked under Mahmood had gone missing over the years, Nadia said, and in each case, the official explanation had been either desertion or voluntary resignation, and in each case, the families had been left with nothing but silence and unanswered questions. This is the story I have been trying to crack open for months, Nadia admitted, but I have not been able to find enough evidence to publish it, and without publication, there is no pressure on the authorities to investigate. She looked at the report in her hands, and then back at Hamza. This document is the first piece of physical evidence I have ever seen that directly links a missing railway worker to Mahmood's operation, she said, and there was a light in her eyes that Hamza recognized, because he had seen the same light in his father's eyes whenever Ahmed Khan talked about doing the right thing, even when it was hard. Then we worked together, Hamza said, and he held out his hand. Nadia hesitated for only a moment before she shook it. And in that moment, an alliance was formed between a 17-year-old factory worker and a 30-year-old journalist that would either bring the truth into the light or destroy them both. The train rolled on through the green heart of Punjab, past villages where children waved at the passing carriages, and farmers led their buffalo along dusty roads. And somewhere in the cars behind them, the men with the sharp voices were watching and waiting and making plans of their own. The train reached Rawalpindi station in the late afternoon, and the old professor gathered his bags and stood up with the slow, careful movements of a man whose joints had grown stiff from sitting too long in one position. He shook Hamza's hand warmly and told him to be safe, and then he turned to Nadia and said something that surprised both of them. I may be old, but I am not blind, he said with a gentle smile. I can see that you two are carrying something heavy between you, something that has weight and consequence, and I want you to know that if you ever need help from a retired professor who knows more about the history of this country's railways than anyone alive, you can find me at Lahore University. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card with his name and address written on it in elegant handwriting, and he pressed it into Hamza's palm before turning and walking off the train into the crowd of people waiting on the platform. Watched him go and felt a sudden, unexpected wave of emotion, because the professor's kindness reminded him so much of his father, of that same quiet generosity that expected nothing in return. The train pulled out of Rawalpindi and began the final leg of its journey north toward Peshawar, climbing gradually into higher and rougher country, where the mountains began to rise on either side of the tracks, like giant guardians standing watch over the valleys below. Nadia had spent the afternoon making phone calls on her mobile, speaking in quick, hushed tones to people she referred to only by single names: Asif, Kiran, Tariq, and Hamza understood that these were her network of sources and contacts that she had built up over years of investigative work. When she finished her last call, she turned to Hamza with a serious expression that told him the news was not entirely good. "I spoke to a contact in Peshawar who works near the railway administration office," she said, keeping her voice low, even though the passengers nearest to them were all asleep or lost in their own conversations. "He tells me that Colonel Mahmood is still very much in charge of the northern routes, and that he operates out of an office in the old railway colony near the Peshawar cantonment station." She paused and took a breath before continuing. "He also tells me that there have been increased security measures at the railway offices in the past few days, which could be routine, but could also mean that someone has warned Mahmood that questions are being asked about his operations." Hamza felt the familiar tightening in his stomach that came with fear, but he pushed it down the way he had learned to push down hunger during the long shifts at the factory when there was no money for lunch. "What do we do when we get there?" he asked. Nadia had already thought about this, and she laid out a plan that was simple, but required both of them to be brave in different ways. She would go to the railway administration office openly, using her press credentials to request an official interview with senior staff about a general story on railway modernization, which was boring enough to not raise any red flags. While she was inside, gathering whatever information she could, and observing the layout of the offices and the people who worked there, Hamza would go to the old railway colony, where the workers and their families lived, and try to find people who had known his father. "Your father worked that northern route for 5 years, Nadia reminded him. "He must have had colleagues there, friends, people who ate dinner with him and shared stories during the long stops at remote stations. And those people may know things that never made it into any official report." It was a good plan, Hamza thought, because it used both their strengths: Nadia's professional access and experience as a journalist, and Hamza's personal connection to the railway community through his father's memory. The sun was going down again, painting the mountains in shades of orange and purple that were so beautiful they almost made Hamza forget for a moment why he was here. And then the beauty faded along with the light, and the world outside the window became dark and unfamiliar. Around 9 in the evening, Hamza got up to use the bathroom, and as he walked through the narrow corridor between the seats, he felt a hand grab his wrist with a grip that was firm but not violent. He turned and found himself looking at a man he had never seen before, a middle-aged man with a thick mustache and tired eyes, who was sitting alone in a window seat with no bag or belongings visible around him. "You are Ahmed Khan's boy," the man said, and it was not a question. Hamza tried to pull his wrist free, but the man held on and shook his head slowly. "I am not your enemy," the man said, in a voice that carried the rough accent of Asan, someone from the northern frontier. "My name is Ghulam Hussein, and I worked with your father on this very route for 3 years before he was taken from us." Hamza stopped struggling and looked more carefully at the man's face, searching for any sign of deceit or danger. But all he saw was sadness and what appeared to be genuine concern. "Please sit down," Ghulam said, releasing Hamza's wrist and gesturing to the empty seat beside him. "There are things you need to know before you reach Peshawar, things that could save your life if you are smart enough to listen." Hamza sat down slowly, every nerve in his body alert and ready to move if this turned out to be a trap. Ghulam rubbed his face with both hands, as if trying to wipe away years of exhaustion, and then he began to talk. He told Hamza that Ahmed Khan had been more than just a conductor who had noticed something wrong. He had been the leader of a small group of railway workers who had secretly been documenting the smuggling operations for months, keeping records of dates and times and cargo descriptions in a notebook that he had hidden somewhere only he knew about. "Your father was the bravest man I ever met," Ghulam said, and his voice broke slightly on the word bravest, the way a rope frays before it snaps. "He knew the danger better than any of us, but he refused to stop because he said that if good men do nothing, then evil men win by default. The group had consisted of 5 workers, including Ahmed Khan, and they had planned to take their evidence to a journalist in Islamabad, who had agreed to publish the story and bring national attention to the corruption. But someone inside the group had betrayed them. 2 days before the planned handoff of the evidence, Ahmed Khan had been called to a meeting with Colonel Mahmoud, and he had never been seen again. In the weeks that followed, 2 other members of the group had also disappeared. 2. Ghulam and one other man named Farouk had been threatened so badly that they had gone into hiding and had not spoken to anyone about what they knew until this very night. "I have been watching you since you boarded in Karachi," Ghulam admitted, and Hamza realized that this must have been the tall man in the dark gray shalwar kameez who had been staring at him on the platform. "You were the man at the station," Hamza said. Ghulam nodded and explained that Bilal's uncle had also been a friend of Ahmed Khan years ago, and when the uncle had found the report in the records office, he had contacted Ghulam because he knew that Ghulam was one of the surviving members of the group. "I came to the station to see if you were really going through with this, to see if Ahmed's son had his father's courage or his father's sense," Ghulam said with a sad smile that suggested he thought those 2 qualities might be contradictions of each other. That had been burning inside him since the moment Ghulam had grabbed his wrist. "Is my father alive?" The silence that followed was the longest and most painful of Hamza's life. Ghulam looked out the window at the darkness rushing past, and then looked back at Hamza with eyes that held something complicated. Something that was not quite hope and not quite despair, but somewhere in the terrible space between them. "I do not know," he said honestly. "After the night of the meeting with Mahmoud, nobody saw your father again, but we also never found proof that he was dead. And in this business, the absence of proof can mean many things." He leaned closer and dropped his voice even further. "But I will tell you this. The notebook your father kept, the one with all the evidence he had gathered, was never found either. And Mahmoud's people searched for it desperately in the weeks after your father vanished. Which means they did not get it from him. Which means that wherever your father went that night, he either hid that notebook or took it with him." Hamza felt something bloom in his chest that he had not allowed himself to feel in 3 years. It was hope, fragile and dangerous and stubborn, and it was growing. The train pulled into Peshawar Cantonment Station at 2:30 in the afternoon, under a sky that was clear and cold and bright blue in a way that Hamza had never seen in Karachi, where the sky always carried a haze of dust and smoke from the factories and the traffic. He stepped off the train onto the platform and felt immediately that he was in a different world, a harder and older world, where the mountains loomed close and the air smelled of pine trees and wood smoke, and something ancient that he could not name. Nadia stepped down behind him and adjusted her glasses, and looked around with the sharp observant gaze of someone who is always cataloging details and filing them away in the organized shelves of her mind. Ghulam was the last to join them, and the 3 of them stood together on the platform, like a strange little army that had no weapons and no plan beyond a shared determination to find the truth. They found a small and inexpensive guest house near the station, run by an elderly couple who asked no questions and charged very little, and they took 2 rooms and agreed to meet downstairs in 1 hour, after they had washed and changed and prepared themselves for what was to come. Hamza used the time alone to call his mother from a public phone, and when he heard her voice, he felt tears prick his eyes for the first time since he had left home. She asked if he was safe, and he told her yes, and she asked if he had found anything, and he told her that he had found more than he expected, and that there were people helping him now, good people who had known his father and who believed in what Ahmed Khan had tried to do. "Be the man your father raised you to be," she said softly, and those words settled into Hamza's bones like warmth from a fire on a cold night. When the 3 of them gathered downstairs, Nadia laid out the plan once more, and they divided up their tasks. She would go to the railway administration office the next morning with her press card and her cover story about modernization, and she would try to get eyes on the office layout and identify who worked closest to Mahmud. Ghulam would take Hamza to the railway colony where the workers lived, a neighborhood of small houses built decades ago by the railway authority for its employees and their families. And there they would look for people who had known Ahmed Khan, and who might know what had happened on the night of his last meeting. But it was Ghulam who changed the plan before they even left the guest house. He sat down heavily in a wooden chair and looked at Hamza with those tired eyes, and said that there was one more thing he had not mentioned on the train, because he had not been sure if he could trust Nadia. But now that he had spent time with her and seen how she operated, he was ready to share the last piece of the puzzle. "Your father had a locker," Ghulam said, "at the Peshawar station, locker number 73 in the old storage room that the conductors used to keep their personal belongings during layovers between shifts." Hamza's heart began to pound again. "After your father disappeared, Mahmud's men searched the station from top to bottom. But the old storage room had been closed for renovations at the time, and the lockers inside it were sealed behind a construction wall. And by the time the renovation was finished, months later, everyone had forgotten about those lockers, except for me." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small brass key that was dull with age and scratched from years of being carried and held and worried over like a prayer bead. "Your father gave me this key 1 week before he vanished," Ghulam said, placing it on the table between them. "He told me that if anything ever happened to him, I should wait until it was safe and then open the locker and give whatever was inside to someone who could use it properly." With shame, as he continued, "I was too afraid to use it," he admitted, and the words seemed to cost him physical pain. "For 3 years I carried this key and told myself that the time was not right, that it was too dangerous, that I needed to protect my own family first, and every excuse was true, and every excuse was also a coward's excuse." He pushed the key across the table toward Hamza. "But your father did not raise a coward for a son, and I will not let my cowardice be the reason his sacrifice was for nothing." Hamza picked up the key and closed his fingers around it, and the brass was warm from Ghulam's pocket, and it felt alive in his hand, like a small heart beating with the last echo of his father's courage. The next morning they went to the station before sunrise, when the platforms were nearly empty, and the only sounds were the distant rumble of freight trains being loaded in the switching yard. Ghulam led them through a side entrance that he knew from his years working the northern routes, down a narrow corridor that smelled of oil and rust, past doors that had not been opened in years, until they reached the old storage room at the very back of the station. The room was dusty and dim, lit only by a single window high up on the wall that let in a thin beam of gray morning light, and along both walls stood rows of metal lockers that were dented and scratched and covered in a layer of grime that spoke of years of neglect. Locker number 73 was in the far corner, and Hamza walked toward it with steps that felt both too fast and too slow at the same time. He put the key in the lock and turned it, and the mechanism resisted for a moment, as if the locker itself was testing whether he deserved to open it, and then it clicked, and the door swung open with a screech of metal on metal that echoed through the empty room. Inside the locker was a leather bag, old and worn, but carefully wrapped in plastic to protect it from moisture. And when Hamza lifted it out, he could feel that it contained something solid and rectangular and about the size of a thick book. He opened the bag with trembling hands and pulled out a notebook, a simple composition notebook with a green cover that was filled from the first page to the last with his father's handwriting. Ahmed Khan had written everything down: dates, times, names, cargo descriptions, license plate numbers of trucks that met the trains at remote stations, amounts of money that changed hands, and the names of every official who had participated in or profited from the smuggling operation. It was all there, page after page after page of careful, detailed evidence, gathered by a man who knew he might not live long enough to use it himself, but who wanted to make sure the truth would survive, even if he did not. Nadia took the notebook with hands that were shaking, and began to flip through the pages, and with each page, her eyes grew wider and her breathing grew faster. "This is everything," she whispered. "This is enough to bring down not just Mehud, but the entire network. Everyone from the local station masters to the senior officials in Islamabad, who have been protecting this operation from above." But at the very back of the notebook, tucked between the last page and the cover, was something else. A single sheet of paper folded into a small square, and when Hamza opened it, he found a letter written in his father's hand. It was addressed to him. The letter was short, and Hamza read it standing there in that dusty room, with tears running freely down his face, while Nadia and Ghulam stood quietly beside him and let him have this moment that belonged only to a son and his father. Ahmed Khan had written the letter on the night before his meeting with Mehud, knowing that he might not come back, and in it he told his son that he was sorry for what was about to happen. Hamza would understand that some things in this world are more important than one man's safety. He told Hamza to take care of his mother and Fatima, to make sure his sister finished school, to be kind to people, even when the world was cruel, and to never stop believing that truth and justice were worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed impossible to win. The last line of the letter said simply, "I am proud of you already, for whatever you will become." Hamza folded the letter and pressed it against his chest, and stood there in silence for a long time. Then he wiped his eyes and looked at Nadia and Ghulam, and spoke in a voice that was quiet but steady, and carried a strength that surprised even himself. "Let us finish what my father started," he said. And they did. Nadia published the story 2 weeks later in 3 major newspapers simultaneously, with copies of the notebook evidence sent to the Supreme Court and the National Accountability Bureau on the spot. Same day, so that no single person or institution could bury it. Colonel Rashid Mahmoud was arrested at his office on a Tuesday morning while he was drinking tea, and the look on his face when the officers showed him copies of Ahmed Khan's notebook was the look of a man who realized that the ghost he thought he had buried had risen from the earth to destroy him. 14 other officials were arrested in the following weeks, and the investigation expanded to reveal a smuggling network that had been operating for nearly 15 years and had moved millions of rupees worth of illegal goods across the country, using the very trains that were meant to serve the public. Ahmed Khan's body was never found, and the question of whether he was alive or dead remained unanswered even after Mahmud's trial, because the colonel refused to speak about that night no matter how many times he was asked. But Hamza carried his father's letter in his jacket pocket every single day from that point forward, and every morning when he woke up, he pressed his hand against it and felt the paper crinkle against his heartbeat, and he told himself that his father was out there somewhere, riding a train through the mountains in the north, where the snow never melts and the rivers run clear, and that one day they would find each other at some small station along the way. The train of truth, Hamza had learned, always reaches its destination eventually, no matter how many times powerful men try to block the tracks. And that was enough to keep him going.